heard the brave stories, as we just did, of survivors of religious persecution. But I'm here to introduce a leader who, in fact, needs no introduction, and that's, of course, Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and one of the greatest champions of religious freedom. He's promoted the fundamental right to freedom of worship for decades. And Tony is a committed humanitarian. Before he left office in 2007, he tripled the UK's aid program for Africa. During the UK's presidency of G8 in 2005, he spearheaded an agreement on 100% debt cancellation and an increase in global aid flows to Africa. And since leaving office, Tony has spent considerable time supporting efforts to protect religious liberties. I know firsthand because Tony and I toiled together for nearly 5 years on Middle East peace. The Tony Blair Institute for Global Change works on some of the world's most difficult problems. Among many things, the Institute supports influential and respected religious and community leaders with training and resources to counter the spread of extremist ideology. And Tony's work is at the forefront of innovative ways to support religious minorities and prevent oppression. As this ministerial highlights, societies flourish when religious freedom is respected. Tony has been central to efforts to promote that concept and our basic human rights. So please join me in welcoming Prime Minister Tony Blair.
It's most kind. It's amazing how nice people are to you when you leave office. First of all, say it's a great pleasure and honour to be here at this ministerial, to thank David Hale, who I worked with for those 5 years, banging our heads against the great brick wall of the Israeli-Palestinian question. And can I also say a word of thanks to all the survivors that have spoken here at this conference. They are remarkable for their courage. They are inspiring in what they've told us, but most important of all, they give us a call to action. And I think we should always remember that we can state the facts of religious persecution, but the truth is we need action to end it. So, religious freedom is a great cause, but vastly understated in its importance. It is, of course, a moral cause, but the freedom to worship according to conscience and belief is also of deep relevance to peace, prosperity, and security. At the end of the last century, we thought that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disappearance of that political ideology would come a new and benign global order. Instead, that comforting illusion was shattered by terrorism and conflict, precisely based on a perverted sense of religious rather than political fervor. The abuse of the religion of Islam by Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, ISIS and other terrorist groups, however, does not stand alone. Extremists have hijacked other faiths, warping their proper meaning, persecuting those who practice a different faith, sowing seeds of bitterness and hate, dividing communities and creating a climate of insecurity and fear. The denial of religious freedom comes in different forms. Sometimes it's non-state actors, terrorist groups for example. Other times it is the state. The consequence is more than the harm to the persecuted, serious though that is. The fact is that all modern successful developed nations adhere to the principle of religious freedom. And they do also to the principle of the rule of law. These principles are not incidental to their success, but integral. The more tolerant a society, the more successful the economy. Today, as you will know, the world is changing with unparalleled speed. Travel, migration, the internet bring people together as never before. We're at the beginning of a fourth industrial revolution, which will alter radically how we live, work, and think. But this change will all tend to shrink the world's boundaries. Educated people will prosper, the open-minded will flourish, and an essential component of success will be the ability to traverse the contours of faith and culture with ease. Immigration can strain the fabric of the host community, but by and large, societies which welcome the energy of migration will do well. In this new world, culture and colours and customs will mix and mingle to mutual benefit. And as the technological revolution takes hold, and creativity, adaptability, emotional intelligence become prized qualities for employment and citizenship, attacks on religious freedom or the existence of religious prejudice, those are the very things that will cripple progress and hold back development. If we look back in history, religious persecution has never had a happy outcome, least of all naturally to the persecuted, but not even for the perpetrators. We think back to the expulsion of Muslims from Spain, the centuries-long fight between Catholic and Protestant in Europe, periodic pogroms against religious minorities, which always weakened the society indulging in them. In more modern times, the removal of Jewish populations from the Middle East following the establishment of the State of Israel evicted many talented, hard-working families to the immense detriment of the countries concerned. To think that 100 years ago, 1/3 of the population of Baghdad was Jewish, and many Jews held prominent positions in the government of Iran. More recently, the persecution of Christians in the region has driven the numbers in the Christian community down. Tragic, of course, for Christians, but also to the disadvantage of other religious communities. My strong view, having spent many years working there, is that the root of the struggle in the Middle East should not be characterized as Arab versus Persian or Sunni versus Shia. It is better understood as one struggle against extremism, whatever its manifestation, and a struggle for religiously tolerant societies and rule-based economies as the only viable future for the region, as well as, in my judgment, the only basis for lasting peace in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. In Africa, where my institute now works with some 15 different governments and their leaderships to implement reform, the rising challenge is increasingly extremism and terrorism as much as traditional issues of development. The Sahel region, for example, poses a huge risk not just to the countries in the Sahel, but to the surrounding region. In fact, you could trace your finger across the globe and you find outbreaks of religious intolerance directed at Muslims, Jews, Christians, and even smaller faiths such as the Baha'i. And shamefully, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are parts of Western society today. But always, the outcome is not just misery for the victims, but regression for the country. In some cases, governments are the offenders, not through religious bias, but through anxiety over the capacity of faith to give allegiance to a higher power. But I want to focus specifically on the persecution which is religiously motivated. Here it can be the state which is the persecutor, but otherwise it is elements within society which the state is unable to defeat or contain, and which kill and terrorize those of different faith. My institute now publishes a yearly detailed analysis of terrorism worldwide. Over 60 countries experienced acts of terror last year. But the violence doesn't come out of nowhere. The Institute's work is based on the belief that unless we eliminate the ideology behind the violence, we will never remove the violence. And that it is the turning of religion into a totalitarian political ideology which is the primary evil. Religious groups should, of course, have the right to participate in the political life of the country, to express their views based on their faith and to follow that faith. So it's not the interaction between politics and religion per se which is the problem. It is rather where the religion itself becomes a political ideology, where followers of one faith or one strand of one faith believe that their view of religion should govern everything. And that everything includes society, economy, the law, even government itself. Such a confusion of political ideology and religious belief inevitably turns totalitarian. Those who don't believe are excluded and delegitimized. Such groups demand religious conformity, are intolerant of difference and hostile to diversity. Some then justify violence in the name of faith because they don't recognize the other as an equal but as an enemy. The perversion of Islam by the Islamist extremists and the violence associated with it derives from the Islamist ideology. The violence in religious persecution never starts with an act, but with an idea. That's not to say that all Islamists, or indeed all extremists from other faiths, are terrorists. Plainly they're not. Some condemn violence strongly. But if you believe that only one faith and only one way of practicing it should govern the entire political space, you are already on the path to persecution. It follows that we will never defeat extremism by security methods alone. Yet whilst over the past 2 decades we've spent trillions of dollars on security, hundreds of billions in airport security alone, for example, we've invested the tiniest of fractions of that amount fighting the ideas behind the violence. And my judgment is it's time to rebalance our efforts. So we need the following. First, we should recognize this is a global challenge and requires globally agreed action and solutions. As the world becomes more interconnected and therefore interdependent, nations are obliged to cooperate, whether in stabilizing the global economy or tackling damage to the environment. The denial of religious freedom is not simply the denial of a basic human right. It is a source of conflict which rarely stays within the boundaries and borders of one nation. Therefore, the campaign for religious freedom needs to be raised up the political agenda with urgency. In fact, I think it would be a very fitting item for any country hosting the G7 or G20. Secondly, the research in my institute has found religious intolerance often starts with the education systems of many countries, formal and informal, where either the practices or teaching, even the curriculum, promote the closed and bigoted view of the world in which other faiths are delegitimized or disparaged. Across parts of Asia and Africa, every day millions of young children grow up educated to regard the other as alien and enemy. It is no wonder there are new generations drawn to extremist thinking, a proportion of whom will then graduate to violent extremism. So we argue for a global commitment on education, a high-level international accord whereby countries agree to promote cultural tolerance and root out cultural prejudice from their education systems, whether in the formal or in the informal sector. Indeed, because we believe that, as well as thoughts, you need action, the program of my institute, Generation Global, which links up children and students of different faiths and now operates in 30 countries, our experience operating this program is the moment you give young people the opportunity to explore those who are from a different faith, they learn, they understand. In place of ignorance, there is knowledge, and in place of fear, there is harmony. This is a very obvious thing. We should be doing those programs as part of a global commitment on education. Such thinking should be a part of any modern education curriculum. This is not, by the way, teaching young people to be religious, but to be culturally aware. I believe there will be widespread support for such a commitment. Even those countries with obvious problems in their education system would welcome it as a means of forcing the more resistant elements within their own system to change. This commitment can be part of a wider drive to eradicate hate speech and extremism of all forms. But we need countries to give leadership to such an endeavour, make it a political priority, show a willingness to agree certain core steps and actions to make good the principle. And thirdly, we need to mobilise the fight back against extremist doctrine and thinking amongst the religious community itself. There's a natural reluctance amongst people from my profession, the political class, to talk religion. But where the ideological wellspring of extremism is a religious conviction, albeit a mistaken one, it can't be avoided. The ideas of the religious extremists are doctrinal. They must be beaten ultimately by better ideas and doctrine. At least one dimension to this struggle is therefore religious. And there are many good and sound theologians and clerics to carry out this task, many of whom have been at this conference. But they need help in organising. In other words, if one part of the origin of religious discrimination is religious in nature, we deal with it as such. I should not pretend that the extremism arises solely from social factors. No doubt social and economic factors play a part, but so does religious belief, however misplaced. It is a commonplace among some in the West to see faith as declining and organized religion as a relic which in time will disappear. But for much of the world, faith still matters. In some countries, numbers of practicing adherents to faith are rising. For example, by 2050, the number of Muslims will virtually have doubled over the course of the century, and for example, be a significant part of the European population. The global Buddhist population will be about the same as it was in 2010, whilst the Hindu and Jewish populations will be larger. And in the United States, Christians will decline from more than 3/4 of the population in 2010 to 2/3 by 2050. Put all these factors alongside the force of globalization, pushing the world closer together, and religious freedom becomes a vital determinant of future peace and prosperity. Countries that are religiously free are going to be countries that are happier, more socially cohesive, and economically better off. So, in summary, my plea today is very straightforward. It is to give the fight for religious freedom its proper priority, not peripheral, but central. Not a fight left to NGOs, but one taken up by governments, and not governments left to campaign on their own, but joined together in one effective global movement in favour of tolerance, against religious persecution, and believing that freedom of religion is an essential part of a decent and humane world. Thank you.
Mr. Blair has graciously agreed to spend a few more minutes to answer some questions. We were able to reach out to a few of you to get some, what would be the question you would want to ask the former Prime Minister? And based on the excellent speech you gave, sir, I even jotted out a few more. Yesterday, at the launch of the ministerial at a side event, the Pew Forum for Religion and Public Life released its new study documenting the increase in restrictions on the free practice of religion around the world. They've seen over the past decade, every year, a continual rise. What would you think we would witness if advances to religious freedom were not made, if those trend lines, those negative trend lines continue?
Well, I think if you end up with a central conflict between a world that technology, travel, migration is pushing together, and people retreating into a form of cultural extremism, where you see people of different faiths as illegitimate, then we're in for a very turbulent time. And you know, the truth is that it's always, religion can easily be abused because it's about faith, and faith is a very powerful motivator for people. So if people can be persuaded that their faith actually involves them in persecuting others, then you're likely to end up with a persecution that is very deep, very lasting, and very, very damaging. You know, there's a story told when we worked on the Northern Ireland peace agreement. Because these things then become very much part of someone's identity. And at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, obviously a big difference between Catholics and Protestants. And there was a story of a young guy, actually from Pakistani origin, who was then brought up in Northern Ireland. And if you wander into the wrong neighborhood at night, you get stopped by either gangs of the Catholic extremists or the Protestant extremists. And this young guy was going through the area, and he was stopped, and they started to hassle him. And you know, he finally said to them, "Look, I don't know why you're stopping me, I'm a Muslim." And they said, "Yeah, but are you a Catholic one or a Protestant one?" So, you know, when religion becomes, it departs from the essence of faith and becomes a badge of identity in opposition to another, it becomes a political distortion that's just like any form of racism or nationalism. And that's the risk. So if we end up with the world moving closer together, you know, I remember when I grew up in the north of England, I think I was 12 years old when I saw my first person who wasn't white. I mean, I was brought up in a homogenous community in the north of England. You know, there was we wouldn't have even known what the concept of diversity was. Now I think of my own children and their range of friends, different faiths, colours, you know, ethnic backgrounds. That is the world today. So that's the world. You better ensure that people are comfortable going across these boundaries of faith and culture.
Yesterday, at the start of the ministerial, after Secretary Pompeo spoke, we had 3 survivors of persecution speak. We had the rabbi from the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, who was there when the gunmen attacked. We had a Muslim gentleman from one of the Christchurch mosques who lost his wife in the shooting. And we had a Sri Lankan Christian who's been ministering to survivors of the Easter bombing. And something for everyone in the audience to know about, their theme was love and forgiveness across the board. And we didn't script that. We gave them just the faintest outline and a time slot, and that organically came out. It was a beautiful, moving thing to hear. What would be your advice for how we engage those voices to counter the faith actors who are acting in negative ways? How do we lift them up? How do we empower them so those voices of love and inclusivity are heard?
Well, I think you need people like that to call out the better angels of our nature. And their testimony is extraordinarily powerful. I suppose my feeling is that they need then to have governments acting on the back of that, because ultimately, you know, this is not going to be a problem that will be solved unless there is consultation and a program of action. And so that's really what I've come to the conclusion, you know, that it's easy to issue calls from politicians for everyone to get on. The best people to make that statement are the survivors, because they're the people with the most reason to hate, and if they show and demonstrate love, this is an extraordinary thing. So they're the best people to do that. But the currency of politics that's very easy is sympathy. The currency of politics should be action. And that's what needs to change. And one of the reasons why I think it's very important, this conference is taking place, and it's a bigger event than I think than last year, and but it really needs, I think it needs, I mean, David Hell mentioned what we did with Africa and debt in the G8 in 2005. I think it needs a big commitment from a high-level political gathering. Because, by the way, there are many things countries in the world will disagree on, but they should better agree on this. And it's in everyone's interest to do it. And I think even though it, by the way, it's then uncomfortable for certain countries, because let's be clear, some of the countries that, well, for sure at the G20, have a, let's say, a poor or patchy record in some of these issues. Why not call it out and get it on the table? And if I was back in active politics today, which right now, with what's going on in my country, I'm quite glad I'm not, but if I was, I would be putting this issue on the agenda. I have become absolutely convinced it is central to making the 21st century peaceful.
In your speech, you made a very impassioned call for rebalancing. The statistics you cited just about airport security alone versus what countries are putting into combating extremism and promoting religious freedom. As a former head of state or former prime minister, what would be the argument you would make to the heads of state now for why they should rebalance? What's the argument?
Because, for example, mind you, education is a security issue today. I mean, if you're, if we decided that we would invest even a small proportion of what we invest in security, we actually invested in, for example, helping countries root out the prejudice within their education systems, helping them support programs where children are talking to those of different faith. And I was in Jordan a short time ago where we have a program there, and just linking young people out from the Bedouin community with others in the same country was hugely impactful. And to hear that these young people talk about how they changed their way of thinking as a result of engaging with those who are different, I mean, it's fantastic. And it's a sort of very, part of the trouble with politics is that sometimes what's completely obvious doesn't make it onto the agenda. I still can't work it out even after all these years in it, but to me it's completely obvious that if you, for example, in parts of Africa have systems where young people are getting educated, but educated in a very narrow curriculum, with a very narrow view of the world, why are we surprised if we have terrorism? Because you're creating the soil in which those extremist thoughts breed. So I think, I don't think it's hard to see what you should do. I just think at the moment this is still too much with my folk, with the politicians. It's still too much seen as, that's kind of fluffy stuff that you can talk about, but the real action is scanners and security checks and special forces. But if you're creating just the next generation of extreme thinkers, a proportion of who will go into violence, you find you're losing battle unless you go to the roots.
We've got an audience here. This is also being live streamed. People who are dedicated to this issue from every faith and none, from every corner of the world. What would be your advice to them for how to motivate elected leaders, government officials on these issues? What were interventions when you were in politics that you found persuasive and helped bring you along to where you are today?
Well, what I tried to do in my speech was in a sense answer that question by saying, again, my experience of my own profession, politics, is that you need a focal point to campaign around. In other words, you need to be able to rally people to a clear position. So when we did the debt and aid campaigns, which, by the way, PEPFAR program grew out of that, which is probably the largest single life-saving program that is which was done by the American government, an incredible thing, and is still very active today. But we were able to do that because there was a coming together of civil society and political activism around a very specific proposal. And that's what I think this needs. So that's why I think there's no way out of this that doesn't involve a clear agreement, which I think should be done at a global level. I mean, we are used to this now. I mean, not to. I know there are different views on the environment issue in Washington, but the thing is, I think what that process taught me is that, in a sense, people have come to a view that you have to accept some sort of responsibility, global responsibility as a global citizen for what happens inside your own borders. If what happens within your borders is going to have an effect on other people. And so that's why I think, the pollution of the planet is one thing, but the pollution of the mind is also important. And so I think it is something that could be properly done into a structured intervention. And we need to then mobilize this against hate and extremism, and we've got a whole raft of new challenges with technology, where these things can spread. And social media is a great connector, but it's also, frankly, it connects the bad as well as the good. And there's a whole agenda out there, therefore, that has to be dealt with. So my sense is the way people can get involved from civic society and non-governmental organizations is to come together with political activists around a specific set of proposals and make this a big point of debate with the political leaders. And freedom of religion, and it's such an obvious and important thing. And it's a strange thing because I speak as someone who's of faith myself, but one of the things that I've done in recent years where I've had more time to do it is to read much more about other faiths and to explore other faiths. And you realise that ultimately many of the moral doctrines, at least associated with faith, are the same across the faith boundaries, and they all spring from a strong belief that there's something more important than you, and that compassion towards others is an essential part of what makes you human, and that do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a principle that wherever it originates is common to all faiths. And therefore when you look at how the world of faith itself is going to develop in the 21st century, and here's where I sort of depart from the political script, I think it would be tragic if faith was diminished. I think it would be a real problem if a sense of spiritual well-being and endeavour became excised from our lives because religion had been taken over by people who regard it as a sort of political fight by another means rather than as a deep-rooted belief. And so I think we're also, when we're combating religious persecution and advocating religious freedom, there's a bit of me that also thinks this is the best way to make sense of spirituality and faith in the 21st century.
As time is wrapping up, I was really struck by you sharing about your childhood growing up and now comparing it to your children today. And I had a similar experience growing up in a rural part of the United States, and now my kids have friends who are Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Christian of all stripes. And that's a really powerful way to teach tolerance because they have friends. That's a tough method to replicate. just as some closing thoughts based on the work of your institute and just your work in politics, how do we overcome fear of the other? What can we take forward from this point to teach interfaith understanding, the benefits of pluralism and diversity?
Well, I think, so we've spoken about education, which is obviously very important, and this can be done. Sometimes I talk to people in America about this, and they say, well, but, we don't have religion in our schools. And I say, it's not, you're not teaching, you're not trying to propagate a particular view of religion or indeed religion. You're just trying to make people understand the origins of the other and what motivates them and what they feel and think about their own faith community. So it really is about cultural awareness. But I think the other thing is that we need to be able to educate people not just for reasons to do with social harmony, but I am really struck by the way the world is changing, how fast it's changing, and what a difference it's going to make to the employment prospects of not just people in the developed world, but the developing world. So my institute actually published a report last week in Africa about the effect of automation and AI on African jobs going forward, and which is going to be, by the way, very considerable, with opportunities, with a lot of displacement. But the thing is this, what you realise, and here, I'm from a generation that struggles sometimes with technology, and indeed my children always say to me, I should never talk about technology in public because they have vast accumulated evidence that I don't understand it. But I do understand its impact. And the thing about the world that's going to happen, and I think it's going to happen at a speed we really haven't come to terms with, is those who succeed will be those with creative and open minds. And therefore your education systems are going to have to undergo big change in our countries. And you're going to divide the world into those that can handle that and those that frankly are going to be absolutely alienated by it. So there is another reason that, apart from all the obvious reasons, it is true that successful societies are religiously free. And it's because if you're persecuting people on the basis of their religion, that says something about your society that is fundamentally at odds with the way the modern world is developing. So there are a myriad of reasons why this is an important question. And they're not all just to do with the obvious thing that people should be free to profess their faith. It's also because societies that do not promote religious tolerance and have within them religious prejudice, those are not going to produce the winners of the future. So this is why I think at every single level, this question is timely, it's important, and we just need to make sure that it, as I say, my sort of final plea in my speech now is it's got to come up the political agenda. It's got to go into the first order and not where it is at the moment, which is a bit between the second and the third.
The card has got some information about just the remaining schedule. No, it's massive. That's it. So just some wrap-up points to let you know about the activities.